I'd been with the company for over 42 years. 42. It's hard to even wrap my head around it sometimes. It's not that I was the most talented guy in the room or anything like that, but I always showed up. I did my job, and I did it well. I worked my way up from a junior operations assistant to a senior operations manager, saw the company grow, change, and, in a way, become a part of who I was. GRWW. Manufacturing wasn't just where I worked, it was where I invested everything. My time, my energy, my loyalty. That's the kind of guy I was. No matter how tough things got, I stayed the course. I'd been through financial downturns, layoffs, shifts in management, and everything in between, but I always believed in the company's core values. So, when I got the call that Friday afternoon, 2 days before my stock options were about to vest, I couldn't believe it. The words that came out of Lisa, the HR rep's mouth, still echo in my ears. "Mr. Mitchell, we've decided to terminate your employment effective immediately." She sounded so calm, so detached, like she was just reading a script. I sat there, staring at the phone in disbelief. My mind raced. There must be some mistake, I thought. Maybe this was a misunderstanding. But no, Lisa went on to explain that the decision was final and the severance package was already prepared. She didn't even give me a chance to speak before she hung up. I didn't even move for a while. I just sat there, staring at the walls of my office, a space that had become so familiar over the years. The same walls I'd spent countless hours in, troubleshooting production issues, developing new strategies, guiding the team through rough patches, and celebrating the wins. And now, just 2 days before I was supposed to get what I was owed after decades of dedication, they were telling me to pack up and leave. It didn't make sense. I knew things had been tense over the past few months. There were a few disagreements here and there with the new CEO, Richard Shaw, but that was normal. New leadership always came with growing pains. Richard had only been with the company for a couple of years, and though we didn't always see eye to eye, I figured it was just part of the adjustment. But this felt personal. The timing alone screamed foul play. I had seen the financial numbers. I knew that in 2 days I was about to become eligible for my stock options, something I'd worked hard for over my entire career. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than just a standard termination. After all, I'd been with the company since I was 22. I'd seen the highs and the lows, the expansions and contractions, the deals, the mergers, the layoffs, and the growth. No one had worked harder for this company than me. Yet here I was, on the receiving end of what felt like a cold, calculated decision to strip me of everything I had earned. I couldn't help but think back to the meetings that had taken place over the past year, the quiet murmurs about restructuring, about streamlining the workforce. There had been little whispers about cutting costs, eliminating redundancies, and reducing unnecessary overhead. But these were just buzzwords, words that didn't mean anything until they hit home. And now, sitting there in that office, I knew exactly what had happened. It wasn't just about performance or cost cutting. This was a strategy, one that had been carefully planned to get rid of me at just the right moment, just before my stock options would vest, just before I'd become fully vested in the company that had been my life for over 4 decades. I walked out of my office stunned and headed straight for my car. I had no words for anyone. My mind was spinning, but one thought kept repeating over and over. They've done this on purpose. They knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't just fire me, they fired me at the most strategic time. And that's when the anger started to set in. Driving home that night, I went through every meeting, every conversation I'd had in recent months. And then it hit me. There were signs I had ignored. Richard's sudden interest in cutting corners, his push to optimize the company by removing veteran employees. All these were red flags that I'd shrugged off as typical corporate restructuring. I had always trusted the company, always believed in the integrity of those running it. But this was a betrayal. They knew what they were doing. The worst part? I wasn't even given a chance to explain myself or offer any sort of defense. No, they had made up their minds long before that phone call came through. I didn't matter anymore. I was just a number, just a cog in the machine. And the machine, well, it was running just fine without me, or so they thought. But there was something they didn't count on. I wasn't going down without a fight. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the severance agreement they had sent over via email. It was all so neat and tidy. Terms and conditions, with the company's best interests neatly tucked in. They offered me a cushy payout, some extended benefits, and a couple of options for a smooth exit. But what they didn't offer was the truth, and the truth was that I had been wronged. That's when I knew I had to do something about it. The next few days were a blur. I was consumed with one thing. How could I make them answer for this? How could I prove that what they had done wasn't just bad business practice? It was outright manipulation. They had taken something from me, something that I had earned, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I didn't know what my next move would be, but I knew I wasn't going to let it slide. My 42 years with that company meant something, and I wasn't going to let them erase that with a phone call and a severance package. The shock of my termination hadn't fully worn off, but the anger was starting to settle in. I realized that this wasn't just a personal attack on me. No, it was far bigger than that. I had spent over 4 decades working for this company, and now I had been discarded like a piece of old equipment. The more I thought about it, the more I knew that my firing was part of a much larger plan. One designed to wipe out people like me who had been around for too long and had too much influence. They didn't just want to get rid of me. They wanted to strip me of what I had earned, my stock options. My hard-earned benefits were sitting just out of reach, and I wasn't going to let them pull the rug out from under me without a fight. But where to start? The first thing I knew I needed to do was gather evidence. I wasn't going to just sit back and let them get away with this. I had to be strategic, careful, methodical. They might have thought I was just some old-timer who'd eventually fade away, but I had more fight in me than they realized. The first step was reviewing everything, every email, every report, every meeting I had attended over the past year, and every document that had crossed my desk. I had access to most of the company's operations, financials, and internal communications. I had been privy to sensitive conversations, and I wasn't going to let any of it go to waste now. It was time to find something, anything, that could prove the company was operating under questionable terms. I spent nights poring over old files and reports. My office, which had once been a symbol of accomplishment, now felt like a battlefield. I sat at my desk, working by the dim light of my desk lamp, sifting through hundreds of pages of contracts and company memos. Every so often, I'd stop, reread a document, and find something that made my blood run cold. There were references to financial irregularities, deals that didn't seem quite right, and executives being awarded bonuses and stock options under strange circumstances. As I put the pieces together, it became increasingly clear. There was something much bigger going on behind the scenes. I knew I wasn't the first one to notice the irregularities. Over the years, I had flagged multiple issues within the company's operations. Some had been swept under the rug, others ignored outright. It wasn't unusual for a company as large as ours to have some bumps in the road. But the more I dug, the more I saw a pattern that pointed to something far more sinister. There were unapproved financial dealings. Bonuses were being given out to the CEO and top executives without proper justification. And the board had been making decisions that directly contradicted the company's long-standing policies on ethical conduct. By the time I reached out to Rachel, I had compiled a small stack of documents that I thought could be useful. But I needed more. I needed someone who knew the legal ins and outs of corporate policies. Someone who could help me navigate this mess without making a single misstep. Rachel had been a legal advisor at the company years ago before she left to pursue other opportunities, and we'd stayed in touch since. She knew the company well and had always been someone I trusted. I called her that night, not sure what I was going to say at first, but when I finally explained the situation to her, she didn't hesitate. "Tom, you've got to do something about this," she said. "This isn't just about you. It's about what they're doing to the company and to other people." She was right. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about exposing the truth. Rachel helped me get organized. We began collecting more emails, memos, and contracts, documents that were meant to stay hidden. Slowly but surely, I built a case. The deeper I went, the more I realized this wasn't a simple case of corporate downsizing gone wrong. No, this was something worse. This was a well-thought-out scheme to push out employees who had been loyal for years while lining the pockets of the upper brass. People like me, who had worked hard and dedicated their lives to the company, were being systematically eliminated to ensure that the leadership could pocket the company's assets without any real oversight. One night, as I sat there going through the final batch of documents, I came across a series of emails between the CEO, Richard Shaw, and some of the other board members. The emails discussed cost-saving measures and optimizing the workforce. In one email, Shaw explicitly mentioned targeting long-time employees who were more expensive than younger, less experienced ones. It was a cold, calculated decision. I had been nothing but loyal to this company, but loyalty meant nothing to them. The bottom line was all that mattered, and if that meant tossing aside people like me, so be it. I wasn't just going to let this slide. I could feel the weight of the documents in my hands. Each one was another piece of the puzzle, a small victory in the fight to take down a corrupt system. Rachel suggested that we needed to go to the authorities, that the SEC would be the best route to go, especially if we could prove that they were violating securities laws by manipulating the stock prices and benefits of longtime employees like myself. That's when the decision was made. I was going to blow the whistle. I wasn't just doing this for myself. I was doing it for the people who had been affected by this company's greed. I would make them pay for what they had done to me, to my colleagues, and to the future of the company. But first, I had to make sure the evidence was airtight. I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. And so, I continued my work, late nights, endless paperwork, and an ever-growing sense of resolve. Every time I uncovered something new, it fueled my determination to see this through. They thought they could silence me. They thought they could sweep everything under the rug, but they had underestimated me. It wasn't just about the stock options anymore. It wasn't just about getting even. It was about making sure that the truth came out. The decision to blow the whistle didn't come easily. It never does. I'd worked for that company for over 4 decades, pouring everything I had into it. My sweat, my energy, and my loyalty. Those were the building blocks of my career. I had spent countless nights at the office, often sacrificing time with my family, always thinking that the company had my back, as I had theirs. I had watched it grow from a small, regional manufacturer to a powerhouse in the industry, and I was proud to have been a part of that journey. But now, here I was, a few days away from my stock options vesting, and suddenly, without warning, I was handed a termination letter. They made it clear I was out, and not just out of a job, but out of my rightful earnings. This wasn't just a case of bad timing. It felt like a calculated move, a corporate game played on a board where I was the pawn, and now that my options were about to pay off, they were discarding me. I couldn't wrap my head around it at first. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just a bad decision, maybe a mistake, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't a mistake. I had worked closely with the company's senior leadership for years, and I had seen the signs. There was something very wrong happening beneath the polished surface. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that I had been witnessing something much bigger than just my own firing. The truth was, the company had been manipulating its financial reports for years. They had been inflating profits, cooking the books to make the company look more profitable than it was, and hiding the real financial situation. The executives had been making deals under the table, pushing for numbers that didn't align with reality. And when I started to question things, to look deeper into the numbers, I was told to drop it. That was the first sign I had. But it wasn't until after my termination that I realized just how deep the corruption ran. I sat with the termination letter in my hand for hours that day, staring at it, trying to understand what had just happened. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't personal. I wasn't fired because I had done something wrong. I was fired because I was getting too close to the truth. My stock options were a threat to them, because if they let me stay long enough, they would have to answer for what they had done. And that's when it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was the one who had been watching this company for years, documenting everything, noticing discrepancies that others hadn't. But now, I wasn't just an observer. I was the one who had to do something about it. I knew I had a choice. I could quietly accept the termination, take my severance package and move on. But that was never going to sit right with me. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about what had been happening in the shadows. This was about the countless employees, the shareholders, and the public who had no idea what was going on behind closed doors. And so, I made a decision. One that would change my life forever. I would blow the whistle. I reached out to Rachel, a former legal advisor I had worked with years ago. She was one of the few people I trusted completely. Over the years, we'd shared a few late-night talks about corporate ethics and the ways companies like ours could sometimes veer off course. Rachel had always been on the side of doing things right, no matter the cost. I knew she would understand. When I told her about my firing and the evidence I had gathered, she didn't hesitate. "Tom, this is bigger than you. This is bigger than the company. You have to take it to the authorities." I knew what she meant. It was time to go to the SEC. I had all the documents I needed, the emails, the memos, the internal financial reports that showed everything. I had spent months collecting the evidence, making sure everything was in order. But still, I had to ask myself, was I ready for this? Was I ready to be the person who exposed it all? The stakes were incredibly high. I could lose everything, my reputation, my career, my relationships, but I couldn't stand by and let these people get away with it. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't act. The next step was to organize everything. I spent days going through the documents, sorting them by relevance, by timeline, by impact. It was exhausting, but I was methodical. I wasn't just bringing a complaint to the SEC, I was bringing the smoking gun. Everything had to be perfect. It wasn't just about me. It was about making sure that this company was held accountable. I remember the day I made the call to the SEC. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number, but my mind was clear. I wasn't backing down. I knew this was the right thing to do, no matter what happened next. When the agent answered, I kept it simple. "I have information that could expose a large-scale corporate fraud scheme. I want to meet with someone to discuss it." The agent sounded skeptical at first, but I could hear the change in their tone when I mentioned the size of the company involved. "We'll schedule a meeting," the agent said. It wasn't long before I received confirmation. I had an appointment. I was about to walk into the belly of the beast. But as the day of the meeting approached, I felt a sense of quiet resolve wash over me. I had spent my career trying to be ethical, trying to do the right thing even when no one else did. Now, I was being asked to take a step that would test that integrity in a way I had never imagined. But I wasn't afraid. I was angry, sure, but more than that, I was determined. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. This was about making sure that the culture of corporate greed and secrecy came to an end. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The morning of the meeting arrived, and I stood outside the SEC building, holding that thick folder filled with evidence. It was a lot to carry, but it wasn't heavy in the way I thought it would be. It wasn't a burden. It was a mission. I took a deep breath and walked in. There was no turning back now. But as I crossed the threshold of that building, I knew something had changed in me forever. No longer would I be the man who stayed quiet, the one who kept his head down and trusted that things would be okay. I had taken a stand, and I wasn't going to stop until the truth was known. What happened next would reshape everything, not just for me, but for the company, for the people involved, and for anyone who ever thought about letting corruption slide just because it was easier. I had just taken the first step in a long journey, and no matter where it led, I knew I had done the right thing. The moment I walked out of the SEC office, I knew nothing would ever be the same. I had just handed over everything, the memos, the emails, the spreadsheets, proof of a scandal that could destroy one of the most powerful companies in the industry. I had no illusions about the road ahead. I knew I was stepping into a storm, but the truth had to come out, no matter the cost. In the weeks that followed, the news started to break. It wasn't just a ripple, it was a tidal wave. The media caught wind of the SEC investigation, and soon, the entire corporate world was watching. The company's stock plummeted almost overnight. The once proud brand that had been a household name was suddenly in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. "Corporate fraud at major manufacturer exposed," the headlines read. The extent of the financial manipulation was so deep that it sent shockwaves through the market. Investors, who had once trusted the company, began pulling out in droves, and the stock value tanked faster than I had ever imagined. I watched it all unfold from a distance, in the comfort of my small apartment. It felt surreal, watching the company I had devoted my entire life to unraveling so publicly. The scandal was everywhere, on TV, in the papers, online. I had thought the worst would be the immediate backlash from the company, but the weight of it all, the media, the shareholders, the public opinion, was far greater than I had anticipated. As expected, the company's leadership began to scramble. They were trying to manage the damage. First came the internal memos from the board, as they tried to calm their employees and assure the public that everything was under control. But I knew it was all smoke and mirrors. They didn't have control. They were losing it by the minute. I started to get calls from former colleagues. Some were supportive, others were angry. Some people had always known that the company's financials didn't add up, but they had never been brave enough to speak out. They called me a hero in one breath and a traitor in the next. The ones who were upset were mostly the ones who had been close to the executives, who had profited from the same shady deals I had uncovered. They wanted to know why I had done it, why I had exposed everything. I could hear the frustration in their voices as they asked me the same questions over and over. Why did you blow the whistle, Tom? You had so much to lose. You could have just kept quiet. But I knew I had made the right choice. There was no going back now, and the worst thing that could happen was for me to backpedal, to let the company cover up what had been happening for so long. So I stayed silent, waiting for the next shoe to drop. Then came the company's desperate attempt to make amends. I got a call one morning from a senior executive I had worked with for years, Charles, who had always been a straight shooter. He asked to meet with me. When we sat down, the message was clear. The company was in crisis, and they were willing to do anything to stop the bleeding. Tom, we need you to reconsider your position, he said. We'll offer you a consulting role, a hefty severance package, and a chance to help us rebuild. You've been with us for too long to let this destroy your legacy. It was a tempting offer. The money was good. It was more than I had made in the past 10 years combined. But that was the problem. Money couldn't undo the damage they had done. They were offering me a chance to help them cover their tracks, to play the role of the good guy who helped clean up their mess. But I had already made my decision. I wasn't in this for the money. I was in this to make sure the truth came out, to make sure people understood just how deep the corruption ran. If I took their offer, I would be complicit in covering up what I had exposed. So I rejected their offer. The fallout wasn't just financial, it was personal. The company's internal culture was one of loyalty, of long-term relationships, and of teamwork. Suddenly, that culture felt like a lie. Colleagues who had once been friends were now cold, distant. Some were outright hostile, especially the higher-ups. They couldn't believe I had gone public, and they certainly couldn't fathom why I had refused their generous offer. But I knew what I had to do. I couldn't allow myself to be part of their cleanup crew. The company needed to be held accountable. What had happened wasn't just an error in judgment. It was a deliberate, coordinated effort to mislead investors, manipulate the public, and hide the truth from employees. And I wasn't going to be part of their whitewashed version of reality. In the weeks that followed, the company went into damage control mode. They tried to reassure investors with press conferences, claiming that they were taking swift action to address the issues. But the more they talked, the worse it got. The board members, who had once been untouchable, were now in the hot seat. It wasn't long before the SEC issued subpoenas, and internal investigations were launched. The pressure on the executives was unbearable. Through it all, I stayed quiet. I didn't need to say anything more. The truth was out, and the consequences were already in motion. The company's leadership was crumbling, and it was only a matter of time before the full scope of the fraud came to light. In the midst of the chaos, I felt a strange sense of calm. The storm I had feared was finally happening, but it wasn't as overwhelming as I had expected. I had done what I needed to do. The company had been exposed, and now it was time for the truth to run its course. The pieces were falling into place, and I knew the consequences would be far-reaching. This wasn't just about me. It was about the future of corporate accountability, and it was about ensuring that something like this never happened again. And so, I waited. I knew that the storm had just begun, but I was prepared. The company would fight back, of course. They would try to discredit me, offer bribes, anything they could think of to stop the investigation. But nothing was going to stop me now. I had made my decision. The truth was out there, and now there was no turning back. As the SEC investigation progressed, the full scale of the financial manipulation became even clearer than I'd anticipated. The emails, memos, and financial records I'd provided, combined with the testimony of other whistleblowers, painted a damning picture of Mark Hollingsworth, the CEO I had once admired. The company had engaged in deceptive accounting practices, falsifying reports, and misleading investors about the company's financial standing. It wasn't just a few mistakes, but a pattern of deliberate, calculated fraud spanning years. Mark was at the center of it all. The prosecution laid out the evidence with precision. Records that showed how Mark had signed off on questionable transactions, approval of inflated bonuses for executives, and direct involvement in misleading financial statements. It was no longer a matter of minor errors or misunderstandings. It was corporate corruption at its highest levels. Sitting in the courtroom, I could barely recognize the man who had been the face of the company. Mark sat beside his lawyer, head slightly bowed, clearly defeated. His once commanding presence had been replaced with the stoic resignation of someone who knew the end was near. There was no denying it. His defense could argue all they wanted, but the truth was there in black and white. The fraud had been widespread, and Mark had been the driving force behind it. The prosecution made their case, showing how Mark had misled the board, manipulated the stock market, and deceived shareholders for years. His actions had jeopardized not only the company, but the livelihoods of countless employees. For me, it was difficult to sit there and watch, not out of spite, but because it was the final confirmation of the decision I had made to expose the truth. Mark's resignation came swiftly. The board could no longer support him, and the pressure from investors was too great. He was replaced by an interim CEO, and the company was left in ruins. Mark's resignation didn't stop the wave of consequences that followed. He was soon facing criminal charges, and the company's stock, already battered, plummeted even further. The media coverage was relentless, and the company's reputation, once unassailable, was now irreparably damaged. By the time the sentencing took place, I watched Mark as he entered the courtroom, flanked by his defense team. His arrogance had melted away, replaced by the grim reality of what he had done. The man who once held the reins of power at the company was now a criminal defendant, facing charges of securities fraud, conspiracy, and financial misrepresentation. The judge's gavel fell, and Mark was sentenced to prison. There was no sense of vindication for me, only a quiet acceptance that justice had finally been done. The company was left to pick up the pieces. Several other top executives, including chief financial officers and board members, were implicated and faced legal consequences. Some resigned voluntarily. Others were let go as part of the restructuring. It was a humbling sight to see the men who had once been untouchable now facing the reality of their actions. The company's leadership had completely collapsed, and while the legal battle was far from over, it was clear the damage was irreversible. As I sat there in the courtroom, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. Not because I was happy about what had happened, but because I knew I had done the right thing. Mark had betrayed the company, the investors, and the employees. He had used his position to line his pockets and mislead those who trusted him, and in the end, the truth had come to light. The company would never be the same, but neither would I. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of the past few months lift off my shoulders. The battle wasn't over, but I knew that standing by the truth, no matter the cost, had been worth it. Months later, I found peace. The whistleblower reward and my pension gave me financial security. I spent more time with my children and grandchildren, enjoying life at the lakeside cabin. I turned down the company's offer to consult, instead focusing on helping others navigate whistleblower protections. One evening, Elizabeth asked, "Dad, do you regret your years at the company?" I thought for a moment, then said, "No. I regret that the truth had to come out this way, but I don't regret standing by my principles." The company recovered with new transparency practices, and I didn't need their reports to know things had changed. What mattered was that I had done the right thing, and my actions inspired others to do the same.